Has it locked your back?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I want it on the halls. Free range puppies.
She locked on the gate a couple times.
Yes. Now we've done the thing. Ta-da!
Yeah.
I can stand up here. Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thanks for those of you joining us online. Thanks Dr. David Weiss coming out from University of Illinois, Chicago, and Dr. Elizabeth Bach from Nachusa for the master's thesis defense of Sheryl Hostler. I'm really excited to have this chance to introduce her and tell a little bit about Sheryl's background. So Sheryl's originally from Pennsylvania. I went to Penn State and has a little different route to her master's in ecology here today than a lot of people. Her undergraduate degree, double major in environmental education and English. And so she spent some time working to introduce people to the outdoors and educate people about nature. And when she approached me about possibilities in graduate school, I was struck by that. I remember the thing she said to me is she reached a point where she didn't just want to be telling people about the discoveries in science, she wanted to make those discoveries herself. I think that's a really great motivation to come back to school. She took biology classes to get a foundation in biology, and then has really thrived in our program here, and I was thrilled to have her join the lab. And when she joined the lab, we talked about possibilities for a project, and this project you'll hear about came up, and Sheryl really seized upon this topic and became an ambassador for dung beetles, which is a great thing to have. It's been a really exciting project, and she's been very successful. She's acquired outside funding to support her work. She's co-authoring a manuscript that's in revision right now and is preparing other work based on this and some side projects. And she's going to be starting a PhD at the University of Illinois, Chicago this fall. I know she'll thrive there as well. But the other exciting thing about Sheryl is she leads this parallel life, much like a superhero, in doing an outreach to the public and science outreach to the general public and helping to translate a lot of the work that we do for people from all different backgrounds. And she's been incredibly successful with that through her YouTube channel and other outlets. And I think it's really kind of setting a new standard for expectations on scientists today, not just to help us understand the world better, but to help interpret it for people and help the public appreciate the work we do and see how it may be of value and matter in their lives. And she's been really successful on that, and that's been fun to watch as well. So I'm excited to have her start today. So the format today is Sheryl will give us a little background on, talk about her project. We'll have the opportunity to open the floor to questions here. And then at some point then the public portion will end and she'll meet with her committee and we'll talk to her more about her project and from there. And that's the plan for today. Okay. So I'm excited to introduce Sheryl Hostler, who's going to talk about dung beetle functional traits related to restoration management practices in tall grass prairie.
Thank you. So when we're looking for ways to evaluate the health or success of an ecosystem, especially a restored ecosystem, we need a method through which we can focus our inquiry. And when restoration managers are working on their lands, they often tend to focus on the vegetative community. And that makes sense for a variety of reasons, but it is not the whole picture or the whole story. When we're trying to rebuild an ecosystem, we need to focus on all trophic levels, including things like consumers and decomposers. And so in our research group, we've chosen to use this idea of ecosystem function as that lens through which we'll be evaluating restorations. Wrong computer. So ecosystem function, or this idea of functional diversity, is basically the idea of looking at how an ecosystem acts or functions. And we can do that by evaluating different functional communities or these trophic groups or organismal groups. And each functional community or functional group has a set of functional traits, or basically characteristics of these organisms, and these can be morphological, physiological, or behavioral traits that allow those organisms to participate in or otherwise facilitate an ecosystem function. And these functions that we're talking about are things like primary productivity in the vegetative community, or pollination, or predation. And these traits or characteristics that the organisms have that facilitate these ecosystem functions can vary in response to variations in environmental factors, which is something we're interested in this research. So I've chosen to focus on the dung beetles. They're beautiful. And the dung beetles are an incredibly important group of decomposers in most ecosystems around the world. They facilitate ecosystem functions, primarily decomposition of dung and also carrion and other waste material. And through the decomposition and dung removal process, and also through their tunneling and the establishment of the burrows where they make their nests, they also facilitate nutrient cycling and soil rotation. I don't think anybody in here would argue that the ecosystem function of decomposition, especially of dung, is super valuable in an ecosystem. It tends to pile up if nobody is removing it and breaking it down. So what the dung beetles do is incredibly important here. Without the dung beetles, we could see things like pasture foulage, increases in disease transmission, and also increases in parasite loads in the local animals. So my research has two primary objectives. The first was to determine how the restoration management techniques employed in an area might change the resulting dung beetle community and that community's functional traits. And the second objective was to measure how an ecosystem function, namely dung decomposition, was related to those restoration management techniques and also to that resulting dung beetle community. So for my study system, I've chosen to do my research in the tallgrass prairie, which is a highly endangered ecosystem. Just here in Illinois, less than 1% of the tallgrass prairie cover that used to exist here remains today. And so most of the tallgrass prairie we're able to interact with in this state is actually through land restorations. When managers are working on restoring tallgrass prairie, they use a variety of management techniques, but most notably, we're interested in two historic disturbances that have been reintroduced to prairie restorations, large native herbivores like the American bison, and also the use of intermittent prescribed fire. I was also interested in examining how the communities in these tallgrass prairie sites change over time, because we take these restorations and they start out as post-agricultural fields, they're planted as prairie, and then they're able to age over decades, and we hope that as they age, they come to more closely resemble the original prairie that was here. Specifically, I've been doing my research at the Nachusa Grasslands, a site of over 3,000 acres of remnant and restored prairie that's administered by the Illinois Nature Conservancy. Our research was done in 15 study sites that you see pictured here on the map. The two red sites are our remnants, so these are sites that were never plowed under and they've always been prairie. The blue sites are our bison units, so these are where the bison have access, also in this remnant. And the yellow sites are where the bison do not have access, as well as this remnant. The restorations range in age from approximately 4 years since planting to over 30 years since planting. And we set the age for the two remnants at 35 years because that is the time period at which these sites came under the Nature Conservancy's management. These, with the lightning bolts, are the sites that were burned in spring 2018 prior to the sampling that I'll be discussing here. And within these 15 study sites, we established 20 study grids. At each of those 20 study grids, I set out arrays of 10 pitfall traps, some baited with fresh bison dung, in order to collect a variety of arthropods, but mostly interested in the dung beetles. After the insects were trapped, the samples were brought back to the lab, sorted, identified to species, and counted. And then a subset of those were dried in the drying oven, masked, pinned, and measured under a microscope reticle. And we were pinning them and measuring them under the microscope to gather some of these morphological measurements like the length of the pronotum, the length and width of the elytra, as well as the length of the foremost and hindmost femur, so the big part of the leg, because the size and ratio of these morphological measurements has been shown in the literature to have an effect on the efficacy of dung removal by these beetles, i.e. bigger beetles are better at moving more dung. Makes sense. Concurrently with the May-June pitfall trapping session, we also ran a dung decomposition study. So again, In each of these 20 study grids, we set out 10 measured pats of bison dung, all on hardware cloth like you see here. 5 of the dung pats in each study grid were also encased in a cube of window screening, which was meant to exclude arthropod activity so that we could measure decomposition facilitated by dung beetles and other dung-associated arthropods, as opposed to decomposition just due to weathering and microbial activity. This picture is actually a really great example of exactly what we were hoping to see. This large hole in the middle and all of this dirt sort of shoved off on the side is evidence of tunneling by one of our larger tunneler dung beetle species. So to return to the objectives, first I wanted to determine how the restoration management techniques like the reintroduction of bison, the use of prescribed fire, as well as the aging of these sites over time since reestablishment, how all of those things changed the dung beetle community and their functional traits. So for most of the graphs you'll see coming up now, the y-axis will be abundance per trap day. And here on the x-axis we have no bison, yes bison. And this one feels pretty intuitive. When there are bison making dung in the prairie, there are more dung beetles, which is something that we certainly expected to see, but it's really interesting to see just how dramatic the difference is here. There are vastly more dung beetles present in the sites where there is all of this extra historically available resource. I was also able to do some species-specific abundance analyses because we have 4 species that are incredibly abundant in the prairie, and when I say that, I mean they are present in every site in large enough numbers that I felt confident to run these analyses. So in the top left, we have Onthophagus hecate abundance per trap day, and again, no bison, yes bison. And what's interesting to me about this graph is that it looks almost exactly like this graph. Onthophagus hecate is far and away the most abundant species in the prairie. There will be several hundred of this species in a site, as opposed to singletons or tens of any of the other species. So we can see that this species really drives a lot of the trends in the prairie community, and by abundance is just the first of these trends that this species will be driving. In the upper right, we have Onthophagus knausi, so a congener of Onthophagus hecate, although it is quite a bit smaller. And still have no bison, yes bison on the x-axis, but this time we've also included the factor of fire. So the gray boxes are sites that were not burned in spring of 2018, and the open boxes are sites that were burned. We can see that Onthophagus knausi abundance seems to be responding to an interaction of the factors of bison and fire. So when there are no bison, relatively low numbers of knausi regardless. But when there are bison and the site has been burned, that's when we see a dramatic increase in their abundance. I expect that Onthophagus knausi is responding to a behavior of the bison called pyrrhic herbivory. So when the bison preferentially graze and spend more time in sites that were recently burned. And I am also expecting that Onthophagus knausi may be more of a bison specialist, and so they respond more strongly to trends in the bison's behavior, and so they spend more time where the bison are spending more time. In the lower left, again, abundance per trap day on the y-axis, but this time one of our largest tunneler species, Geotrupes opacus. This one is larger, as in the final segment of your thumb, so it's a very big beetle. And we can see that it is also responding to an interaction between bison and fire, similar to Onthophagus knausi, but with an opposite effect. So Geotrupes opacus seems to be much more common in bison sites that were not burned. And I expect that this may be because of their large body size. These insects are less able to find adequate refugia when the fire rolls through the prairie, and so there may be increased mortality of this species in sites that were recently burned. In the bottom right, we have a single species of dweller dung beetle, so very, very tiny ones. This is Aphodius rusicola, and on the x-axis this time we have site age. So 0 being a site that was just transitioned from agricultural production into planted restored prairie, and all the way out here at 35 being our 2 remnant sites. We can see that Aphodius rusicola's abundance in the sites seems to follow a trend of decreasing with site age. I expect that Aphodius rusicola, much like Onthophagus hecate, may be more of a generalist species, and so the abundance of this species may decrease over time as the sites come to resemble more the historic prairie, and so contain a more historic prairie community of dung beetles. So this dung beetle is sort of competed out of its high abundances. I was also interested in measuring the total biomass of beetles collected in a site. So this time, instead of total abundance per trap day, we have total biomass per trap day. Still no yes bison. And we can see, again, this graph very much mirrors the abundance graph. But the reason we're interested in biomass as well as abundance is because there are certain thoughts in the literature showing either that higher individual abundances of beetles may contribute more to dung decomposition, or that it's more important that we have a high total biomass of beetles regardless of abundance. But we can see in this case that the trend for biomass and individual number of beetles seems to be about the same. I was also able to analyze Shannon diversity in our sites. So on the left-hand graph, we have Shannon diversity on the y-axis, still no yes bison on the x-axis, it's a thing. And we can see that in the bison sites, there's a slightly lower Shannon diversity than in the non-bison sites. As I mentioned before, this Onthophagus hecate species is incredibly abundant in those bison sites, to the point where it may actually be excluding any other species. And so we have a little bit of a decrease in diversity in those sites because Onthophagus hecate is dominating the community so much. In the right-hand graph, Shannon diversity still on the y-axis, site age on the x-axis, and the circles down here are the unburned sites for the year. The triangles up top are the burned sites for the year. These two factors are pictured on the same graph, although there is no interaction between them. But independently, both site age and prescribed fire increase the Shannon diversity in our sites. What's really exciting here is actually the trend of site age. So we use our remnant sites as sort of goalposts, or what we assume the prairie should be acting like. And so it's nice to see that the diversity of the dung beetle community seems to be trending towards the what the remnants have as the sites age, and so they're probably acting more like prairie as they age. But I started this talk saying that I wanted to examine the restored prairie through this lens of functional diversity. So even though all of the more traditional community measures and analyses I just went through are valuable, we really want to dig a little deeper into what functional diversity can tell us about the dung beetles in the prairie. So functional diversity can be analyzed through 4 basic metrics. The first 2 are pictured on this slide. And we start with functional richness, which is very similar to species richness that a lot of people are familiar with. So functional richness is basically the breadth of values that are possible for any of these functional traits. So if we have a low functional richness, that would mean a very small amount of the potential values for these traits are actually represented in the community. Or if we have high functional richness, that means that almost all of the potential values for a trait are represented in a community. Pictured here, along with functional richness, is functional evenness, again, similar to our traditional idea of evenness. So this is taking into account the abundances or the amount of representation for each of these values for a trait. So we have high functional richness and evenness here because all of the values are represented approximately equally in the community. And over here we have high functional richness but low evenness because the values are represented in varying amounts.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
What are the L-shaped curves representing?
It's another way of picturing the same idea. Is that, I'm not sure what you meant.
Are they intended to represent different species?
So the species all would be there's no units on these, but yeah, so like all of the species that have this value for this trait would make up that bar that's telling you how high it is. So that's the amount of representation for that value for that trait. Is that?
By pointing out.
Yeah, these are just showing the sort of trends. Yeah. I'm not sure. Is that?
No, I'm not sure.
Represent species.
Hmm?
I think each one's got to be a species.
Is it? Okay, I thought they were. The other two functional diversity metrics are related. So we have functional divergence and functional dispersion. So functional divergence, these are both two-dimensional representations, but we can also think about these in a three-dimensional volume for multiple traits being considered at the same time. But functional divergence is whether or not the majority of the species lie far away from sort of the center or average or the centroid in a three-dimensional space, or whether they lie all very close together and close to that centroid in terms of how they represent the values of these traits. Functional dispersion is related to functional divergence, except that that centroid of the three-dimensional space is actually pulled or weighted by the abundances of the species. So if we have an incredibly abundant species that also happens to have fairly average functional trait values, it could very dramatically pull the centroid. Spoiler alert. So how do we use these things? What do they tell us? So if we have a low functional richness in a site or in many sites, that means that we have relatively few values represented for the traits that we're interested in. And that could indicate that there are potential unused niches in that community. If we have a low functional divergence, that means that all of the species are more centered along that continuum. And if we have low functional dispersion, it means they're all centered along that continuum and also very close to that weighted centroid in terms of how their abundances are laid out. So for this graph, we have log functional richness on the y-axis, no yes bison still on the x-axis, and the gray boxes are the sites that were not burned in spring 2018. Open boxes are burned. And we can see that functional richness seems to respond to an interaction of bison and fire. When there are bison and fire present in a site, the functional richness is dramatically lower. What's really interesting to me about this graph is that, picture this one quick. See this? It's the inverse. And I think that's really interesting because Onthophagus knausi and Onthophagus hecate are, as I said, far and away the most abundant species in our sites. So it would sort of make sense that if those two species are dominating in burned bison sites, that we get this much lower functional richness. So those graphs are in inverse of one another, and we're thinking about the dominance of the community, which also comes into play in these two graphs. We have functional divergence on the left and functional dispersion on the right. No yes bison on both of the x-axes. And we can see, again, that both of these measures are decreased quite a bit when the bison are present in these sites. Again, I think this has everything to do with Onthophagus hecate as a species overwhelmingly dominating in terms of numerical abundance in these sites. And the dispersion is quite a bit lower yet, probably because that overwhelming abundance pulls the centroid in the three-dimensional space. So to summarize all of the dung beetle community results, the presence of the bison does increase the dung beetle abundance and the total biomass. I was able to find some species-specific effects that responded in part to interactions with those historic disturbances. The Shannon diversity in the sites was decreased by the presence of bison, but did increase when it comes to site age, which is something we were hoping to see. And the presence of bison and fire interacting decreased functional richness, and bison alone decreased functional dispersion and divergence. So now to move on to my second objective, where we actually evaluate an ecosystem function itself. How does the dung decomposition rate in our sites relate to the restoration management techniques we've been discussing, and also to the resulting dung beetle community? So if you'll think back to how I described the dung decomposition study at the beginning, we had 5 pats in each site which were accessible by arthropods, namely dung beetles, and 5 pats that were caged inside cubes of window screening to exclude arthropod activity. So the first thing we wanted to know was, do arthropods, and specifically dung beetles, actually have an impact on dung decomposition? So here on the y-axis we have % dry mass lost from the dung pats. And still, at this time, we have no cage and yes cage on the x-axis. For reference, yes cage means no arthropods, no cage means yes arthropods. And so we can see that when there is no cage and there are arthropods, the dung pats lose quite a bit more dung, even over this only 3.5 to 4 week period that they were out in the prairie. So this is good news because it means that we were actually looking at the right thing. The dung beetles do matter. Alone, the dung pats may still decompose, but it would take much, much longer. And the interesting trend that we were able to find with how the dung decomposition relates to the management factors we were interested in is site age. Again, 0 is a site that's just come out of agricultural production. Over here on the other side, we only have 1 remnant this time. The other remnant was excluded as a dramatic outlier. But we can see a trend where the dung decomposition rate seems to be declining as the sites age, which is a little odd and not necessarily what we expected. But it may be because our remnants are a little atypical. This is something that a lot of people in our research group have been encountering, is that the sites that were never plowed under for agriculture are rocky hillsides and other areas which may not have been optimal for agriculture, and so they might be acting in ways that are not the way the sort of flatland prairie would have acted, but I still think a lot more needs to be done to investigate why this is happening. You'll also notice that the factor of bison is pictured on this graph as well, with the circles being non-bison sites and the triangles being bison sites. It looks like there could be an interaction here between the presence of bison and site age, but we have no middle-aged and older non-bison sites, and so we weren't able to sort of pull this trend line out to really show that there is or is not an interaction between those factors. I also do not have any graphs for relating the dung decomposition to any of the dung beetle community measures. We didn't find any interesting significant effects, but again, this may be sort of an attenuation of effects from the management through the dung beetle community to decomposition, and I'd like to continue looking at some of this stuff in my PhD. But to summarize all of the results, the bison presence does increase total dung beetle abundance and biomass. Fire and bison interact in many of the sites in the prairie for a lot of our measures, which makes sense because these are historical disturbances that often interacted during the evolution and development of the prairie. Functional richness, functional divergence, and functional dispersion were all lower in the bison sites, but I expect that that is because those communities are overwhelmingly dominated by a single or a few species. We did find that arthropods are responsible for most of the dung decomposition happening in the prairie, and that the decomposition rates tend to decrease with the age of the site. And more dung beetles because they're pretty. So what does all of this mean for the prairie in general and for the land managers at Nachusa in particular? Well, first, the reintroduction of the bison does support a robust dung beetle community, at least in terms of biomass and abundance, which is good because more things making dung means hopefully there are more things eating dung so that we don't get buried. We also showed that ecosystem function as a way of evaluating the health of these restorations is vital because we want to know not just if this thing looks like a prairie, but does it actually act like a prairie? Is it a prairie? And what's nice about using functional diversity as a metric is that we can tailor it to the priorities of the land managers. If managers are particularly interested in decomposition because they just reintroduced bison, or they're particularly interested in primary productivity because we want to counteract climate change, ecosystem function is a great way to tailor our evaluations of restorations and how we manage them. However, we also showed that that's kind of not always the best way to evaluate things, specifically when the community is overwhelmingly dominated by one or a few species. I didn't expect that this would be the case when we started the research, but I have sort of found an answer that I think explains why our communities look this way and why our evaluation did not wind up the way we might have expected. So there's a very interesting paper that talks about the problem with the extirpation of bison from this region. So they were gone for quite a while. And any dung beetles that may have been specialists on bison dung or reliant on the bison, their resource, and also their ecosystem engineer services may have gone extinct. And so even if we bring bison back and we restore the prairie, those beetles can't be brought back. They don't exist anymore. And so we've created this fundamental and irrevocable change in the community. I would like to thank the NCHUSA staff, crew, and volunteers, especially Bill Kleiman, Cody Considine, and Dr. Elizabeth Bach. Thank you for your unending patience while we tromped through the prairie doing science. I'd also like to thank the undergraduate and grad students from the Barber and Jones labs. Thank y'all for scooping poop with me and carrying lots of dead insects around. I'd also like to thank the members of my committee, Dr. David Wise, Dr. Bethia King, and also my funding sources, Northern Illinois University, Prairie Biotic Research, the Friends of NCHUSA Grasslands, and the National Science Foundation. I would now like to answer any questions and hear all of your best poop jokes. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on why there's an age relationship for the dung decomposition in the non-bison sites?
Well, so like I said, even though I pictured bison here because it was interesting to see a trend emerging, I think that it's more valuable just to look at this without the bison, non-bison, and just say that in all of the sites as they age, decomposition seems to be decreasing. Yeah, I'm not ready to make an evaluation on why this happened because we can't pull that trend line out, and so this particular point might be an anomaly.
Yeah, that point is
Yeah,
something getting wet.
maybe.
I guess following up on that question, are
Sure.
these trend lines, are these like a true regression that you run, or are they just visualization?
It's just a visualization.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is the difference between bison and no bison as simple as the increase in abundance of those two numerically dominant species? And all the other dung beetles are at, if you threw them out, are the other species doing as well with or without bison?
That is a difficult question to answer because in a lot of these sites, it was just those two species. And I don't know if that's just sampling. For instance, I mentioned very briefly the behavioral guilds. So we have tunnelers and we have dwellers, and we caught lots of both of those. There's a third behavioral guild of dung beetles called the rollers. That's what everybody pictures and see nature documentary, and it's rolling elephant poo across the savannah. I caught one individual of one roller species in one site in both 2017 and 2018. And so there may be some differences in how the different behavioral guilds respond to different trapping methods. So we may not be getting everything that we could. I'm assuming if that one roller is out there, there's probably more and we just didn't get them. So yeah, it's a little difficult to say how all of the other species are doing if we were to take those two out, because we didn't find many of the other species in a lot of these sites. Sometimes it was just those two Onthophagus species.
Well, the reason I ask is you could argue in contrast to your conclusion that bison have been beneficial, that in fact you have a less diverse community of dung beetles. But my guess is that you also have a less diverse community of dung because you now have a numerically dominant dung bison.
Yeah,
But there are other dung sources there,
absolutely.
and those are present in both the bison and the non-bison units.
Yeah, and
What are those other sources?
I mean, anything. There are a few species of, again, the dwellers are incredibly tiny, so some dwellers will actually live in small mammal burrows and make use of their fecal resource. There's deer, there's rabbits, so a lot of these are much smaller pats, and so I would expect that the very large tunneler species, at the very least, are almost completely reliant on the bison, but we also have to remember Lechusa is in this context of an agricultural landscape, and so if these dung beetles weren't eating bison dung, they were probably in the pasture eating cattle dung.
I have a related question on that then. I know it's hard to look at, but is there any adjacency effect from cattle fields?
I did a side project this summer. I have not analyzed the data yet, but yeah, I actually did what we're calling the taste test or the buffet experiment, where I trapped using multiple different flavors of bait, and we'll see which they might prefer. I'd also like to do trapping in the future to see if I can put some traps in some of the adjacent pastures and see what's going on.
Do you have a decent map of, would you have a good map of what cow grazing is nearby?
Yeah, I mean, and we also, like, we see them when we're driving around and stuff, so we know that, like, if I go all the way back to the map. Whoops, yeah. So, like, this is the Franklin Creek site, and, like, literally right here, there are sheep grazing, or, like, this is the main remnant, literally right here, there are cattle grazing, so, like, yeah, we see them. I'm sure we could, yeah, make that, yeah.
With that, I have two questions. The first one kind of bangs off of that. Do they disperse well? Do these dung beetles move around the community well, or are we just kind of stuck with the community that was left after it was farmed and fragmented by roads?
Yeah, so they're by necessity more mobile than many insects because the resource they're after is patchy both spatially and temporally. There's one really cool paper that came out of a group that does dung beetle research in Finland where they actually like painted little white dots on them and let them go and saw how far they would disperse. Nothing like that has been done on any of the species here in North America as far as I could find. But yeah, they are mobile to an extent, and certainly the bigger ones are probably more mobile than the smaller ones. But exactly how far they can go, I'm not sure. This is, again, an argument probably for continuity of restored habitats, right? So that it does make dispersal of those species easier. But yeah, also, like I said, a lot of the species that couldn't adapt to sheep or cattle or horse or whatever are probably gone and we can't get them back. So yeah, we built it and the ones who could come came, but the rest of them are probably not in existence anymore, unfortunately. Yeah.
And then my second question was the abundance graph. We have two outliers on it, and I was curious.
This?
Yeah, curious what sites those were and why do you think they're closer to the ones that have bison?
One of them is for sure Franklin Creek. I don't know what the other one is. Maybe Sand Farm. I'm not sure on the second one, but this point has definitely got to be Franklin Creek. And like anybody who's been to our sites, Franklin Creek is weird for a lot of reasons, but one of those reasons is because it's right across the road from the bison unit and right adjacent to that cattle pasture. And so yeah, it has vastly more dung beetles in it than most of the non-bison sites, but they're all that Onthophagus hecatte. It's all that species that I'm assuming is a generalist and just is extremely prolific. And so yeah, it's not that we're seeing any interesting diversity in that site, I just have to count several thousand of the same thing. Yeah, it might be Sand Farm.
And if it
but
is, there is cattle grazing.
Exactly, there's cattle grazing around it. It's also a very wet site, so it might just be more, conducive to them being able to tunnel in the soil and reproduce, that sort of thing. But yeah, I would have to go back and look at my numbers to see which one that actually is.
I was a little bit curious, you mentioned in your answer to Heather's question about the temporal patchiness and diversity.
Yeah.
And I just, last week I was driving around like, there's a lot of poop on the landscape.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, because the beetles probably aren't eating poop right now. So
Yeah.
I was just curious because I don't know much about that, what that temporal component looks like.
Yeah, so it is really odd to drive around in the prairie in the winter and spring before the dung beetles have become active because there's poo everywhere. So the temporal component kind of has a few different facets to it. We've seen from some other members of our research group that the bison eat different things at different points in time. And like, if you look at the dung that's out there right now, it's a very different texture, not to get too gross or technical, but it's a very different texture than the stuff we'll see over the summer, which is much more liquidy and soft. And so the quality of the resource changes over time, but it's also temporal in that there are always, and I put that in quotes because of course we can't say always, but there are always plants on the ground for a grazer to go graze, but there isn't always poo right here, right now. So a dung beetle has to be ready to move to where there might be resource. And also the bison, when we say, yes, these are bison sites, that is with an asterisk because the bison don't spend all of their time in all of those sites, right? So like the dung beetles may have to move as the bison transition what sites they're spending time in, which again, we've seen has some seasonal variation.
Can you talk about their life cycle?
Yeah, so again, unfortunately and weirdly, not as much natural history research about North American dung beetles as about like South American or African or European. I don't know why. Here we are. But the basic life cycle for these, just like most beetles, they start out as an egg, and then they have a larval phase, they pupate and become adults. And so that happens over the course of a year or two. And then what's really interesting about dung beetles is, unlike a lot of insects that go through that true metamorphosis, you might be familiar with the idea that once they're in an adult form, a lot of them don't continue eating. But when a dung beetle comes out of its pupation and is in that adult form, it's actually a subadult. And they go through a period of what's called Reifungsphase, which I love because it's German, but it basically means maturation feeding. So they're sort of subadults, and they feed for a little bit longer until they become sexually mature and then reproduce. So yeah, it's sort of an interesting multi-year cycle. And the couples, I guess I could say, of dung beetles, a lot of them, the males and females sort of work together to find and use the resource to make a nest. So they'll, for the rollers and the tunnelers, they will remove physical material from a dung pat and establish it in an underground burrow and lay one or maybe a few small eggs on or in this dung ball, and then the offspring will hatch out and consume that dung resource until it's time for them to pupate. The dwellers, as the name implies, the adults and the offspring live right in the dung pat all together. They don't do any removal. And so what's also interesting is that dwellers have been shown to contribute the least to the actual decomposition of dung, because both the adults and larvae feed more on the liquid component as opposed to actually removing physical dry mass. So that's why the tunnelers and the rollers tend to be more effective, is that they're actually dispersing the dung across the landscape and burrowing it back underground.
So the answer may be I don't know, but I'm just wondering, do you have a sense of like when they actually emerge and start eating again in the spring, and then when, because I'm assuming they're not doing a lot of eating during the winter, so
Yeah.
they just like hang out in the soil.
Yeah, I don't believe that they're active at all during the winter because it's cold. Yeah, and that's part of the reason that we trapped the way we did. We had the pitfall traps open in May and June, again in July, and again in September, and that was really valuable. I based that trapping regime off of some pilot data that we collected from the summer prior to me actually starting this project, because some of our species, including that Geotripes opacus that I mentioned, that doesn't really start showing up in our pitfall traps until at least July, and it's much more common in September. So they do have a sort of phenological cycling of who is most active, although I will say, again, the two Amphiphagous species, Hecate and Knausi, were always there in very large abundance. So again, they seem to sort of be the ones that are, facilitating most of what's going on in the community. But yeah, they do have staggered emergence, it seems.
One more question on the dung beetles. What are they eating in the poop? Are they digesting the like cellulosic and lignin sort of materials, or are they?
Yes. Yeah. So I read a few papers and books that are sort of entry level coprology, I guess, for dung beetle researchers. Yeah. So they're primarily eating the particulates. They've got filtration type things in their mouths that help them, so they're not necessarily consuming all of the water content, but yeah, they're filtering out the particulate that still has nutrition in it, because of course the bison do not completely digest all of the usable material. Yeah.
Well, yeah, a lot of the garbage. I'm just curious.
Yeah.
If it's garbage even for the dung beetles, like the.
Oh.
The big organic molecules.
I don't, like, if there are still like chunks of grass kind of thing in there, I don't think that's what they're going after. They're mostly going after the smaller. Yeah.
Do they have bacteria in their gut, like ruminants do, that actually?
Yeah, they
facilitate that
have,
breakdown?
as far as again, I'm not a microbial ecologist, but yeah, they do have some endosymbiont gut bacteria as far as I could tell. Yeah, and they also, this was really fun. I didn't know this until I was looking at one under the microscope. A lot of these individuals will be covered in very tiny phoretic mites. So it's arthropods all the way down. But the phoretic mites, some research has shown that those may be responsible for sort of helping facilitate the dung beetle's consumption of and usage of the dung, and that those mites may even be passed on from parents to offspring via like the mites attaching to the nest ball, which is really fascinating, and I'd love to look at those more because that's really cool. Yeah. Anybody else? Anybody ask any questions in here? There are no questions. Thanks, Internet.
All right, well, thanks, Sheryl, again.